She lived in the shadow of her successful husband until one day she heard who he really thought of her as. Instead of screaming, she chose silence. Instead of revenge, the path to herself. Every morning without him became a step towards freedom, and every detail in the new interior became part of her new self. And when her voice finally sounded, it became louder than any apology. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. The morning began as always. Quietly, softly, with the smell of freshly ground coffee, with the rustling of newspaper pages and the barely noticeable creak of floorboards that Evelyn had long ago learned by ear. Sunlight broke through the translucent curtains and fell on the oak floor in stripes, like in an old photograph. Everything in this house was organized, not for the sake of external order, but for the sake of internal peace. Evelyn always believed, a house is not just walls, it is breathing. And if it breathes evenly, then everything is in order. She pulled on a light cashmere cardigan over her nightgown and went downstairs. There was a white cup in the kitchen, warmed up just the way she liked it. Milk, 1/3, medium strength. Miles drank it differently, but he said every day that this coffee smelled like home. She smiled back, silently. For a long time now, silently. His shirt lay on the table, ironed, folded just the way he liked it, with a slight curve at the collar so it wouldn't press on my throat. She didn't know why she kept doing that. He no longer needed to be reminded that she was there. He just knew, but he hadn't thanked her in a long time. Evelyn poured coffee and remembered how they once lived in a small apartment with shabby walls, how he would come home late with tired eyes and say, "I can do this. We will do this together." Then she believed that they were a team. Not because he said it, but because he looked at her as an equal. Because she could talk through every idea, he discussed every project with her, even when he himself did not understand anything about color, texture, or space. Now he discussed everything with others. She stayed in the house, cooked, washed, scheduled appointments, and never complained, because she believed this is partnership, divided by roles but equal. Only now this belief became quieter with each passing day. Today was a normal day. In the morning, getting ready for the evening, when his business partners would come to the house. Miles said this yesterday at the door, taking off his coat. "Dinner tomorrow, 5. I said you'd cook something. They like home cooking, I think." He didn't even look at her. He just said it. As if she was part of the list next to the menu and the wine. She nodded. No irritation, no questions, just habitual. During the day, she washed the floor, wiped down the tables, laid out clean towels in the guest bathroom, arranged flowers in vases. Not because she wanted to impress, because she knew everything had to be right. She always felt it. The right napkin, the right pause between courses, the right smile, even if inside, empty. While the rosemary fish was baking in the oven, she went upstairs, opened the closet, looked for a long time. Then she chose a gray dress, not bright, but made of good fabric. Miles didn't like it when it was too fancy. She wanted to be appropriate. When the guests arrived, everything was ready. The table was shining, the wine was chilled, the light was warm and steady. Laughter began almost immediately. She smiled, greeted, told a joke about how she almost burned a pie. Everyone laughed. One of the guests, a gray-haired man in glasses, asked, "You are a designer, aren't you?" Miles said in an interview that you helped with the interiors of the office. She raised an eyebrow slightly. She wanted to answer, but she didn't have time. "Oh, Evelyn?" Miles interrupted with a slight grin. "She's like our chef, nanny, and firekeeper all rolled into one, like a guardian angel, helping out, watching over the house. Without her, this place would all fall apart." Laughter, nods of agreement, even a grateful look from one of the partners. Evelyn smiled, but inside it was as if something had cracked, not sharply, but subtly, barely audible, like a hairline crack in porcelain. She continued serving, clearing dishes, watering salad, smiling, listening to conversations, and saying nothing. When the guests left, Miles, sipping his brandy, patted her on the shoulder. "You're great, as always." They were delighted. "Thank you." She nodded and went upstairs, without saying a word. Before going to bed, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked in the mirror. Her face was calm, her hair was done up, her makeup was gone, and her gaze was different. Not tired, not broken, just empty. As if someone had turned off the light inside her. And she understood, she ceased to exist, not in life, but for him. He saw home, food, comfort, but not her. She didn't cry. She just lay down and fell asleep in silence. And in the morning, I woke up a little earlier than usual. I made myself some coffee, not for him, not to his taste, strong, black, bitter. Then she packed her things. No rush, no strain, only what was needed. She put her passport in her bag. Her diary, her drawings, the interior sketches she had once made for herself, left everything clean, made the bed, wiped the fingerprints off the mirror, wrote a short note. The maid quit. Good luck finding a new one. And she left. Without slamming the door, without turning around, without tragedy, simply, she opened the door and took a step into the silence in which her own voice could finally be heard. In a small cafe on the corner, between an antique shop and a flower stand, Evelyn looked out the window and stirred her tea, which had gone cold half an hour ago. Life was all around her. People with bags, with children, with takeaway coffee. Someone was laughing. Someone was swearing into the phone. Someone was kissing someone goodbye at the door. Everything seemed real, alive. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was not part of this life, but an observer, a witness, as if someone had pressed pause inside her, but the world outside continued to play on, as if without her. A week had passed since she left, not months, not years, just 7 days. But each of them was drawn out, as if time had decided to show her how many moments in her life she had disappeared into. She lived in a loft she had rented through a friend. The space was empty, with white walls, wooden beams, and tall windows. When she walked in for the first time, it felt like the walls were breathing, and she inhaled for the first time in a long time. She woke up early, not because she had to make breakfast or iron shirts, but because she wanted to. She put the kettle on, opened the window, watched the sun creep slowly between the rooftops. The first day, she just sat on the floor, cup in hand, and said nothing. Not because she was lonely, but because of the silence. It was a different silence, not the kind that rang in Miles's house when he didn't notice her presence, but a silence in which she was not interrupted. Not cut short, not interrupted. She began to draw. At first, awkwardly. The pencil glided across the paper as if remembering her hand. Then, more confidently. Contours, lines, shading, interiors, soft armchairs, light arches, spaces in which a woman could be not a function, but a center. She did not know whether these sketches would become something more, but there was something in them that had not been in her for a long time, herself. One evening, she received a text from Margot. "I saw. Are you really gone?" Evelyn didn't answer for a long time. Then she dialed. "Yes, I left. And, I didn't even cry." An hour later, Margot was standing at the door with wine and hugs that didn't require explanation. They were sitting on the floor, eating pizza and laughing about how Evelyn hadn't known where the corkscrew was for the first time. And then Margot suddenly said, "Do you know that he didn't see you?" "I saw it," Evelyn said, looking at the candle. But as a background, as a familiar softness, as a vase that is always in place. "He didn't appreciate you. He just forgot that I am not decoration." They fell silent. Then Evelyn added, and I allowed it. On the third day, Miles wrote to her. The message was short. Where are you? What's going on? She didn't answer. He called. He wrote again. First demandingly, then softly, then with a hint of panic. He wasn't used to emptiness, especially one he couldn't control. On the fifth day, he sent flowers, white lilies. She closed the door without taking them. The bouquet and the courier were left behind, not understanding that silence was also an answer. And that evening, she went out into the city and went into a small gallery. The exhibition was local, young interior designers. She looked at the installations for a long time. And then, at a stand with a wooden composition of light, she was asked, "Do you like it?" She turned around. A young woman, probably the author. Evelyn nodded. "Very much. You can feel the air here." "I tried," she smiled. "Are you a designer?" "There used to be," Evelyn said. "Why earlier?" Evelyn didn't answer. She just smiled. For the first time, there was no embarrassment in her voice, just thought. That night, she opened her laptop, old, dusty, almost forgotten. There were her old projects, letters, sketches. She looked at them like photographs of a past life, not with pain, with respect, because now she knew she had never disappeared. She was just in the shadows. She opened a new file. She called it Beginning, and she made her first sketch, a room with full-height windows with only one object in it, a chair. To the left of it, a light. To the right, a mirror. In the center, a woman sitting in a chair looking not at the mirror, but at the window, forward, at herself, in the future. And the next morning, she woke up and didn't think she had to explain to anyone why she hadn't made coffee. And it was the best morning she'd had in years. Evening was slowly covering the city, like a blanket slipping off shoulders. The air was filled with the soft light of street lamps and the noise of rare cars, and the sky above the glass facades was losing its daytime sharpness. Evelyn's apartment was subdued, calm, as if the walls were learning to breathe with her. She was sitting on the floor, barefoot, with a pencil in her hand and a cup of herbal tea next to her. On the sheet of paper was a line. Straight, without a bend, confident. The first line in a new project. In a project that she was doing not for the sake of a checkmark, not for a presentation, not for the sake of an impression. For herself. It had been a little over 2 weeks since she had left. It seemed like a short time, but inside her everything had changed. The space where every day had previously been subject to a routine. Get up early to make it to breakfast, clean up while he's in the shower, don't disturb while he's calling, was now free. She got up when she woke up. She could sit by the window for an hour. She could not say a word until noon, and it wasn't perceived as silence, but as a pause filled with silence. She started keeping a diary, not in the usual sense, not dates and events, but scraps of feelings. One day she wrote, "Today I wiped the mirror, and for the first time I didn't turn away." Another day, "When you don't expect anyone to appreciate you, you start to hear your own voice." Her entries weren't about Miles. They were about her. As if she was piecing together herself. The one who once wanted to open a studio, to create private interiors with a history where each object carries not just a function, but a feeling. Sometimes she went out into town. Not to shop, not to run errands, just to walk. She discovered streets she had never walked on because they were inconvenient. She noticed a ceramic shop window where the cups were like sculptures. She went in. She bought one, with jagged edges and a pattern of gold line that seemed to slip over the edge. The salesman said, "It's not perfect, but that's its character." Evelyn nodded. It wasn't just a cup, it was a confession. One day, while sorting through old papers, she found a letter, dated 8 years ago, from her to herself. She was writing in one of the personal growth courses that suggested sending a letter to her future self. She read, "If you're reading this, it means you're still alive. I don't know where you are, who you're with, but I hope you haven't become a shadow. That you remember how you love the smell of paint on your fingers and the way the light falls on a tree at 4 in the afternoon. If you've forgotten, it's okay. Just remember, you have you. That's enough. She sat with this letter for a long time, and then she stood up. She took out a canvas, old brushes, and for the first time in years, she began to paint. Not an interior, not a form, an emotion, a fracture, a color, a silence. She cried when a brushstroke was in the wrong place. And she laughed when her fingers left prints in the paint. It was dirty. It was alive. The next morning, Miles wrote to her again, without pathos this time. Simply, I miss you. It's hard for me without you. Everything seems empty. She read it. She erased it. Not because she wanted revenge, because she felt, in these words, he was still talking about himself, about how he was without her, and not about how she was with him. And these are different things. A day later, he called. She didn't pick up. He came to the door. She didn't open it. He left a note. If you ever want to come back, I'm here. She read it, folded it, and burned it. Not in anger. Simply, as something that no longer mattered. That same week, she launched a website. Her own. Simple, almost empty. Just her name, a few works, and a phrase in the header, spaces where a woman remains herself. The letters started coming the next day. Small orders, offers to meet. Not corporate giants, private, real clients, just as she wanted. And one day, towards evening, when the sun was making the walls warm, an elderly woman called her. She said, I found your site. I have a house where everything speaks with my husband's voice, and he died. I want me to speak in it. Can you help? Evelyn closed her eyes. Yes, I can. After the conversation, she went to the window. A breath of air, even breathing, and a thought. She is breathing again, not for someone else, for herself, and that is the main thing. That evening, the city smelled of rain, although the sky did not dare to pour. The streets were clean, as if washed by the wind, and the yellow spots of lanterns were reflected in the windows of the houses. Evelyn walked slowly, unhurriedly, holding a folder with the first sheets of the future project under her arm. This was her first visit to a client, the first since she left her old life, the first as a freelance designer, not someone's wife, not a shadow advisor, not a woman with good taste. Just her. Just Evelyn. The house she approached was old but well kept. The facade was shabby plaster, a wrought iron gate, the shadow of grapes over the veranda. The woman who opened the door was like the house itself, reserved but dignified. Her name was Irene. Gray hair, precise movements, a voice that held no question, only a request. I need this house to finally stop being a reminder of him, she said, letting Evelyn in. He died 5 years ago, but everything here still speaks with his voice. I want mine to speak. Evelyn nodded, without sympathy, without explanation. She understood, more than she could say. They walked through the rooms. Irene pointed out, here is the chair in which he read. Here is the clock that he adjusted every week. Here is the picture that he hung, despite her disagreement. Evelyn wrote down silently. She did not suggest throwing it out. She asked, And do you like this? And if Irene slowed down, Evelyn made a note. They were drinking tea in the kitchen when she suddenly asked, And why did you start this? Such a turn? Evelyn took a sip and looked out the window. Because one day I realized, I live in a space in which there is not a single object chosen by me. I arranged everything, but not for myself. And at some point I stopped seeing myself. Irene nodded, long, slowly. I know. This feeling is like dust on glass. At first, you don't notice, and then suddenly you realize that you haven't seen anything for a long time. The project took several weeks. Evelyn came almost every day. Together they chose fabrics, rearranged furniture, repainted the walls. Not radically, but definitely. The space began to change. It became softer, quieter. The sharp edges of power and control disappeared. Lightness appeared. Air. Feminine energy. And Irene began to smile more often. One day she said, "You know, now I drink coffee in the chair that I used to hate, because now it is mine. Not because of the purchase, but because I myself chose where it should stand." And at that moment, Evelyn realized that she was doing everything right. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming. The site was alive. Some asked for advice. Some simply thanked for the phrase on the main page. Women wrote, "You gave me permission to stop being invisible. I put a chair by the window. For the first time I allowed myself to sit idle. I threw out the curtains he chose, and finally saw the light." One day, a letter came from Miles. Not harsh, no accusations, just a few lines. "I understand what I lost. Not when I left, but much earlier. If you ever want to talk, I'll be there. Just say so." She didn't answer. Not because she was angry. Because she had already said everything that needed to be said, or rather, done it. In her departure, in silence, in freedom. One evening, as she was walking home, the street suddenly went into a brief eclipse. The streetlights flickered, went out, and for a few seconds everything was dark. Evelyn stopped. She wasn't afraid. She just froze. And then, when the light returned, she kept walking. Her steps were soft but sure. And then she realized, before, when the lights went out, she felt lost. Now she just waited until she could see the road again. Because now she knew she was her own source of light. The morning was quiet, the kind where you don't have to rush, prove anything, or justify yourself to anyone. The light fell softly on the floor of the old loft, playing on the roughness of the wooden boards, and Evelyn, barefoot, walked along them to the kitchen, leaving behind a light trace of her steps and the smell of a body that had just woken up. Coffee, vanilla soap, a little paint on her fingers from the night before. The kettle was boiling on the stove, bread was toasting in the toaster, and morning thoughts were already waiting in the notebook open on the table. She sat here every day. Sometimes she wrote a lot, sometimes one word. Sometimes she just put a period, as a reminder that she had a voice, even if today it sounded in silence. It had been 3 months since she had left Miles. There had been no dramatic turns, no turbulent events, no sudden changes. But with each passing day, something that had been imperceptible before was growing stronger, a sense of stability. No victory, no war, no revenge, no fight. Only a return. To herself, to habits, to breathing. She was living again in a space where she could choose what hung on the wall, what stood on the table, and who walked through the door. The work went on. Smoothly, without shouting or deadlines. The women continued to write. Some asked for consultations, others simply shared. Someone showed before and after photos of the room. Someone sent letters without words, only with a photo of an open window with a chair under it. She kept these letters in a folder on her computer, which she called Alive, because each of them was proof that it was possible to breathe again, and that there were many of them, those who chose not to endure. Sometimes she met with clients in person. These meetings weren't just about interiors, they were conversations, about loneliness, about fear, about how hard it is to allow yourself to be heard. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She just asked questions. Did you choose this yourself? Do you like it? Did you say this out loud? Often the answer was silence, and then tears, or laughter, or a silent nod, and sometimes a hug. One day, a local gallery wrote to her, an invitation to the exhibition Women's Space. They wanted to introduce her as a designer who works not with interiors, but with inner freedom. She was surprised. She refused at first. Then she thought about it and agreed. She brought a series of sketches, not renderings, not drawings, just pencil sketches. A room, light, a woman, and always an open window. At the opening, she stood to the side. People came up to her and asked who the author was. Some recognized her, some didn't. And that was good. Because it wasn't the name that was important. It was what people felt. And one young girl, looking at one of the drawings, said to her friend, "Look, it's like you." When he left, and you put yourself in the center. Evelyn heard, smiled, silently. That same night, she drove home through an empty city. The traffic lights echoed her thoughts. Her apartment greeted her with silence, not cold, but enveloping. She took off her coat, put the kettle on, and went back to her desk. She opened her notebook. She wrote, "I haven't become stronger, I've just stopped being less than I am." Then I closed it and went to bed. Without worry, without lists for tomorrow, without heaviness in my chest. And in the morning she woke up and didn't open her eyes right away. She just lay there, listened to the noise of the city, listened to the breathing of the apartment, listened to her heart beating. And she realized she was no longer waiting for someone to save her, to hear her, to notice her. She was no longer waiting for someone to name her value. She already knew. Everything she needed was already inside. Everything that lay ahead was only hers. And it was from this silence that the present began. Beginning of form. End of form.